Let's go back to the beginning. I'd love to hear you talk more about your family. I mean, you grew up in a family of artists. What was that like, your early experience growing up in a creative family?
Oh, look, I have very sweet memories of my childhood, and both my parents were teachers. My father was a painter and my mum was a jeweller, but she did all sorts of other little kind of things as well. I had two sisters. It was very much surrounded by making. But Dad got this bee in his bonnet that he really just didn't want me to be an artist. I was quite rebellious, but to please my parents, I ended up going to Melbourne State College, which was training for art teachers, in fact. Mm-hmm. And in retrospect, it was amazing because we just had incredible teachers teaching us, you know, people who are really pretty much at the cutting edge of their field, but maybe were slightly under-recognised.
You lived in St Kilda in the early 80s, is that right?
Yeah, it was after I did the teacher training that I came back to live in St Kilda, And that's really when I started my life as an artist. Yeah. And that's when I started to meet a whole circle of creative people that I still know now. So people who were fashion designers, filmmakers, other artists, writers, musicians. We all just hung out in St Kilda at that time, and we'd all be going to see Nick Cave at the ballroom. We'd all be going to the Hardware Club to dance, and, it was still pretty amazing time.
Sounded like an exciting time. But let's talk now about, this is obviously an important time where you really started to paint very seriously.
Yeah.
In those early years of all the 80s, really. Yeah, and I'm impressed by the fact that you didn't have your first solo exhibition until 1987. So that was 7 years after finishing your studies, and you just quietly worked away at what was actually an incredible body of work, which is incredibly resolved. So what was that period like?
Yeah, it's a nice question. I do remember distinctly, because it actually wasn't cool in those days to show during art school, certainly not, or not immediately after art school either. You really had the idea that it was important to earn your stripes, I suppose. But one thing that did come into my lap that was very formative at that time was the big biography on Frida Kahlo. And it was a very detailed biography, and it just sort of suddenly gave me permission to, first of all, be a woman painter and also deal with my own subjects. Not that I didn't know that before, but it brought that into sharper focus. That's where, the painting Tattoo, for instance, emerged from reading that biography. I can say that quite clearly.
It's interesting. I wanted to talk more now about a period in jumping ahead a few years in the early 90s. Tell me about your experience in Paris.
Yeah, I have been lucky, haven't I? I've had quite a lot of residencies, but the travel thing has been very important to me.
It's been constant too, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been constant. I was lucky enough to get the studio at the Cité Internationale des Arts in 1994, I think it was. And again, incredible, just simple room, looking out, as I discovered, directly across the Seine into Camille Claudel's studio. So, right in the very, very centre. We were provided with a UNESCO card, which we could just, flash at the entrance to the Louvre and just walk in, not have to do all the rest, which is an incredible resource. There was a particular show on at the Musée d'Art Décoratif whilst I was there on the history of bedrooms, for instance. it was the most, the French do those historical shows incredibly well. So having seen this History of the Bedroom show, so I think I was going to sleep every night with this sort of swollen head, like full of ideas and sensations, but that got translated to the furniture. So anyway, of course, then I had this idea or this image of a high bed, which I made watercolours of in the studio. And there's a series of watercolours and drawings. And then it wasn't until I came back to Australia that I was able to make that enormous object. But there were other objects, as you mentioned, that came from that time that often started with finding objects in flea markets. And so I bought this 19th century nightdress. It was kind of spooky thing. It was like a heavy cotton. And so that then led me to making Conversation. But Conversation was very much about, two nightdresses with embroidered words down the front, sleeves that extended to meet each other, and then the red threads meeting across the negative space. But to me, that was kind of, like this connection between Paris and Melbourne, myself and my partner back in Melbourne at the time, reaching across the river, across the Seine, to the spirit of Camille Claudel. And then later it became, moved on to La Sonambule, which I used silks and threading silks. And
that's the work where the threads are unravelling.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a sense that that's more ethereal in a way.
Yeah, lighter, more ethereal. And it changed even by changing the fabrics,
A lot of your work, whether it's these installations that we're describing just now or many of your paintings that have followed since, touch on ideas of invisibility, but impermanence, the ethereal, things that are actually quite hard to describe in words. Would you say that's a driving force in your work?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Particularly probably from, as you say, the early 90s. Yeah, that's definitely where a strong sense of trace, I would say, started to be employed in the works.
But yeah, I mean, and I think also many of those early glass works where you worked with artisans who did incredible blown works, for example, there's often a sense that they're stand-ins for people in some way. There's a human kind of trace in many of your works. Or even your own presence with that wonderful work collection of Air. The first one, there's been many actually, where you're in a way mapping a journey, your own presence. It's a motif that's quite strong throughout your work.
Yeah, that's true. The first work in glass was 100 glasses, so it was 91 to 92, and that was the first time I'd worked with a glass blower, Michael Hook, and the wonderful engraver Perry Fletcher, who engraved the words on those glasses. Because I'd made the painting, one room of glasses of water.
That's right.
And then for some reason I thought, the mad ideas you have in your studio, I just thought, it would be quite good to make that. And so that's how 100 glasses came to be. And I really didn't know how that was going to turn out. It was just a sort of a mad idea. But it turns out to be one of my most major.
Yeah, it's a very powerfully resonant work.
Yeah, and still important to this day. Yeah, I deliberately go to seek out artisans who are very good at what they do. And I guess, my work in that is obviously the instructions, what I want to make, the design, if you like, the drawings, and very sort of precise communication. And, watching this kind of collaborative process, almost like by millimetre, as it were, So it's very fine. To this day, that's how it operates.
I mean, many of these ideas that you're talking about, the fineness, the fragility, the kind of impermanence, these are phenomena that you attempt to capture in your paintings, and you have for many decades. So,
Well, the painting behind you is an attempt to paint the scent of jasmine, which is a kind of wild idea, isn't it?
I know that you disagree with the term abstraction to describe these works. So
Yeah, I do.
It'd be good to talk more about that.
I do disagree with it, particularly the recent paintings. They're flower paintings, and they all pretty much all have flower titles. And those paintings are really based on very deep and close observation of the flower space. The paintings, I suppose, were literally about picturing that space. So they are actually versions of what I see in that space. They're versions of that kind of stilled space. So they're not inventions, they're not abstractions.
They're not abstracting something, they're almost like documents or translations of
they
your
are.
experience.
They are actually like that, yeah. But the other thing to say about that was that I guess in my writing over the years, I'd come to realise that the more recent paintings are actually like protest paintings. They're not overtly, billboarding protest, but, protest paintings protest is against, right?
Yes.
So these paintings are against, or let's say provide space in contra to, the busy space out there, the busy, maniacal space that we're all driven to occupy in our daily lives. That's all. That's all I want to say about that.
Yeah, I just want to ask you about daily routine and practice and discipline. I mean, you're in the studio every day mostly.
Well, I come into the studio every day, but I don't. I give myself a lot of space as well. I don't. I'm not a painter or an artist who needs to pick up a paintbrush or a pencil every day. And I would say that quite a lot of my practice is, in the swimming pool even, or walking, or roaming, or flaneuring, whether it be in a flea market or in the garden, or just actually having a really quiet time, having quiet space.
Being open to experience and sensation, I suppose.
In fact, my mother tells me I've always needed quiet space, even as a child. Poor delicate thing.
Rosslynd, thank you. That was such a rich conversation. I learnt a lot. It's just wonderful to hear about the early days and the progression right throughout your career. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Jane. It was really great to have the opportunity to talk with you again. Thank you. Yeah.